Amara's hand clamped onto the man's wrist, her grip iron-tight as she yanked him toward the exit. He was Korean, mid-30s, wearing an Italian suit that spoke of quiet, lethal wealth, with piercing eyes that searched hers as if she had finally snapped. "Get up," she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. "Don't look back, just move." They were cutting through the dining room now. The restaurant was a cathedral of glass and gold, filled with Seoul's power players clinking crystal over plates of lobster and wagyu. Amara was supposed to be serving them vintage Bordeaux, not dragging a VIP through the tables like a fleeing criminal, but the time for professional etiquette had vanished. The man moved with a controlled, dangerous grace, clearly unaccustomed to being forced anywhere by anyone, especially not a waitress he'd never seen before. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and serrated with a sharp Korean accent. "Saving your life," Amara breathed, her eyes darting toward the high windows. "Keep moving." His gaze locked onto hers, cold and calculating, before he allowed her to pull him into the shadow of a marble pillar. A heartbeat later, the heavy glass of the window behind table 7 shattered into a million diamonds. A sniper's round tore through the leather headrest where he had been leaning just seconds before. Screams tore through the air as the elite crowd scrambled for the floor in a flurry of fine silk and spilled wine. The man stared at the splintered remains of his chair, then turned to Amara, his expression unreadable. "How did you know?" To understand how we reached this moment of blood and broken glass, we have to go back exactly 3 hours. Amara Okoye stepped off the bus in front of the luminous tower, her uniform pressed and her mind focused. The skyscraper was a monolith of steel, piercing the Seoul skyline like a needle. Tonight was supposed to be a standard high-stakes shift, a private gala for the city's most influential figures. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she moved to Korea. But after a year of navigating the city's invisible walls, Amara had learned that survival meant staying invisible and always staying alert. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, have you ever left your family behind to start a new life with your lover in another country or state because of safety? Amara wasn't a girl who missed details. In Seoul, an outsider's survival depended on seeing what others ignored. As she smoothed the crisp white fabric of her waitress shirt and adjusted the fitted black vest, she caught her reflection in the locker room mirror. At 26, her eyes held the weary sharpness of someone who had spent a year navigating a city that often treated her as a ghost. She had moved from Houston with dreams of high-fashion runways, but the reality of the industry had been a series of closed doors and polite rejections. Now, her runway was the polished floor of the luminous tower's private dining club, and her audience was a rotation of men who moved the world's money without ever looking her in the eye. The energy in the kitchen was a controlled roar of clinking porcelain and barking orders. Amara moved through it with a graceful, athletic efficiency, her long ponytail swaying with every decisive turn. She was heading toward the service corridor with a tray of crystal stemware when a shift in the ambient noise stopped her cold. Near the heavy steel service doors, 2 men stood in the shadows of the alcove. They weren't dressed in the standard hotel livery. Their suits were too sharp, their postures too rigid. They were speaking in low, rhythmic tones that felt jarringly familiar. Amara slowed her pace, pretending to adjust a stack of linen napkins. Her grandmother had spent decades in Rome, and the summers Amara had spent there as a child flooded back, bringing the fragments of a language she hadn't realized she still kept. "Tavolo set," one whispered, his Italian thick and guttural. "Table 7. "Sai," the other replied, checking a heavy chrome watch. "Il secchino I grave pronto, 7 minuti dopo l'inizio del brindisi." The sniper is ready, 7 minutes after the toast begins. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Table 7. She knew exactly who was sitting there. She had served him his first drink, a man named Jang Tae-Hyun, who possessed a cold, piercing gaze and an aura of absolute authority that made even the other titans in the room lower their voices. The men moved off, their footsteps echoing with a finality that made her blood run cold. Amara stood paralyzed for a heartbeat. In this world, she was invisible, a waitress whose only job was to be silent and efficient. If she was wrong, she would lose her job and her visa. But if she was right, a man's life was ending in less than 10 minutes. She didn't go to her supervisor. She didn't call for security. Trusting the instincts that had kept her safe in a foreign land, Amara pushed through the double doors into the golden light of the dining room, her eyes locked on table 7 while the toast began. 6 minutes 30 seconds after the toast, she got to the table where Jang Tae was sitting. She grabbed him by his hand and dragged him away from his chair. Seconds later, the sudden deafening crack of the sniper's rifle, and the way the leather headrest of table 7 had disintegrated into a cloud of stuffing and dust. The chaos that followed was a blur of high-octane motion. As the elite guests scrambled for cover, a group of men in sharp black suits had flooded into the dining room from the entrance, their movements synchronized and lethal. They had formed a human wall around the man she now knew was Jang Tae-Hyun, shielding him from any follow-up shots. In the midst of that madness, Tihayan hadn't looked at his guards or the shattered window. He had looked only at her. With a chillingly calm hand, he had reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick, embossed card, and pressed it into her trembling palm. He didn't offer a thank you or an explanation, just a silent, piercing gaze that promised he knew exactly who she was. The moderate glow of the television screen was the only thing illuminating Amara's small apartment, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Her hands were still trembling as she gripped a glass of water, her mind replaying the moment the glass shattered, and the elite dining room descended into a chorus of screams. She reached into her apron pocket, which was tossed haphazardly on the sofa, and pulled out the heavy, embossed business card the man had handed her before vanishing into a phalanx of black-suited security. Jang Tae-Hyun. The name felt like lead in her palm. She set the card on the coffee table and pulled her laptop closer, her fingers hovering over the keys before she typed the name into a search bar. The results that flooded the screen made her breath hitch. He wasn't just a powerful businessman. He was a phantom of the underworld. Headlines flashed before her. The untouchable heir of the Jang Empire and speculation grows over underworld succession war. Photos showed him at galas and court hearings, always wearing that same unreadable, ice-cold expression. Amara pushed the laptop away, a cold sweat breaking out across her neck. She hadn't just saved a VIP. She had interfered in a specialized execution of one of Korea's most feared men. The weight of her good deed suddenly felt like a target on her back. If those men in the hallway were serious, she wasn't just a witness. She was a complication. Fear, sharp and paralyzing, took hold. She moved through her apartment in a daze, closing the heavy curtains and locking the deadbolt with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She didn't call the number on the card. She didn't call the police. To her, both sides of that card represented worlds that could crush someone like her without a second thought. For the next 48 hours, Amara became a ghost. She ignored the frantic calls from her restaurant manager and kept her phone switched off, jumping at every creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of a car door slamming in the street. She stayed away from the windows, living on instant ramen and the terrified adrenaline that comes from knowing you've seen something you were never supposed to see. In the darkness of her room, she stared at the silver hoop earrings she'd worn that night, wondering if she had traded her quiet, hardworking life in Seoul for a permanent place in the shadows. By the end of the second day, the silence of her apartment felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap, but the fear of stepping outside was still greater than the hunger gnawing at her stomach. Amara returned to the restaurant on the third day, her movements stiff and her heart heavy with a dread she couldn't shake. Every time the heavy glass doors swung open, her breath hitched, expecting to see a squad of police or, worse, the cold, calculating eyes of the man she had saved. But the morning passed in a strange, hollow normalcy. The shattered window at table 7 had already been replaced with a seamless pane of reinforced glass, and the staff moved with a hushed, frantic energy, as if trying to scrub the memory of the violence from the air. She kept her head down, focusing on the mindless rhythm of polishing silver and refilling water goblets. She was relieved to find that no one seemed to be looking for her. There were no detectives waiting in the break room, and the manager hadn't even mentioned her 2-day absence, likely too preoccupied with the PR nightmare of an assassination attempt in a 6-star establishment. For a few hours, She allowed herself to believe that she was truly invisible again, that Jang Tae-Hyun had simply moved on to his next war and forgotten the waitress who had momentarily crossed his path. However, the silence was its own kind of torture. Every time she walked past table 7, her skin prickled. She could still see the way the leather had disintegrated and smell the acrid scent of gunpowder. She found herself checking the shadows in the service corridor and lingering near the security cameras, her hypervigilance dialed to a frequency that made her hands shake. By the end of the shift, the adrenaline had faded into a dull, aching exhaustion. She slipped out the service entrance, clutching her bag tight against her chest as she hurried toward the bus stop. She scanned the street, looking for the black SUVs she had seen on the news, but the traffic was just a sea of ordinary commuters. She made it back to her apartment, locked the triple deadbolts, and sank against the door, letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 72 hours. She was safe. The week began to slip by with no word, no threats, and no sign of the underworld heir. Amara started to sleep again, convinced she had successfully retreated back into the anonymity of the city. She convinced herself that the business card was just a souvenir of a nightmare that was finally over. But as the 1-week mark approached, the feeling of being watched returned, not with a bang, but with a quiet, terrifying certainty that the debt she had created was far from settled. Exactly 1 week after the night the glass shattered, the heavy doors of the restaurant swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't just the arrival of a customer. It was the arrival of a presence that demanded the air itself stay still. Amara was at the far end of the dining room, smoothing a linen cloth over an empty table, when she felt a familiar prickle at the back of her neck. Jang Tae-Hyun walked in, looking every bit the lethal business titan he had been on the news. He wore a custom black suit and a dark shirt with an open collar, his movements controlled and radiating a terrifying authority that made the other diners instinctively lower their gazes. Behind him, 2 large men with stone-cold expressions stood like silent sentinels, their eyes scanning the room for threats before their boss even took a step. Amara froze, her pulse leaping into her throat. She wanted to bolt for the service entrance, but her legs felt like lead. Tihayan's sharp, angular face turned toward her, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto hers with a precision that told her he had come for one reason only. He walked straight to table 7, now fully restored, and pulled out a chair, not for himself, but for her. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low, serrated rumble that brooked no argument. "Sir, I'm on duty," Amara began, her voice trembling. "Give her a drink," Tihayan said, glancing at the hovering, terrified manager. He turned back to Amara, his expression unreadable but intense. "Sit, we have things to discuss." Amara sank into the chair opposite him, feeling the weight of the room's stairs and the looming presence of his bodyguards. Tihayan leaned forward slightly, his cold gaze softening just a fraction. "Do not be afraid," he said quietly. "I did not come earlier because I was settling accounts. The men who targeted me, and you, are no longer a concern." He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that he had spent the week dismantling the rival gang that had ordered the sniper strike. He told her about his father's exile and how his enemies had hoped to weaken the Jang Empire by removing the heir while the lion was away. "You interfered in a war you didn't understand," he said, his eyes searching hers. "But in doing so, you reminded me that there is still something in this world worth protecting." Amara looked at him, realizing that the man who had been a nightmare in her head for 7 days was now looking at her not as a witness to be silenced, but as the only person who had seen him as a man rather than a target. The restaurant grew unnervingly quiet. The clatter of silver and porcelain fatting as the other diners realized that the man at table 7 wasn't just a guest. He was the gravity in the room. Tihayan didn't seem to notice them. He kept his focus entirely on Amara, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to reconcile her bravery with the simple white-hand black uniform she wore. "My father is a man of the old world," Tihayan began, his voice barely a whisper above the ambient hum of the restaurant. "He built an empire on loyalty and blood, but he is currently in a forced exile, waiting for the political tides to turn. I am merely the architect holding the walls together until his return." He paused, his long fingers tracing the rim of his glass. The men who tried to take my life at this table weren't just rivals, they were opportunists. They believed that by killing the son, they could force the father to stay in the shadows forever. Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "And now," she asked, her voice finding a bit more strength, "you said you settled things." "I did," he replied coldly. "I had to show them that the architect knows how to tear down buildings as well as build them. But being the heir to the Jang Syndicate isn't a choice, Amara. It's a cage. Every meal, every car ride, every conversation is a tactical calculation. Until that night, I had forgotten what it felt like to see someone act purely out of humanity." He reached into his jacket, and for a second, Amara's breath hitched, remembering the weapon she knew was hidden there. Instead, he pulled out a small, velvet-lined box and set it on the table between them. "The world I inhabit is violent and crowded with people who want something from me. You are the only person who has ever given me something, my life, without asking for a price." Amara looked at the box, then back at him. "I don't want a reward, Mr. Jang. I just wanted to do what was right." "I know," he said, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That is exactly why you are in more danger than you realize. My enemies are gone for now, but my father's friends are just as dangerous. They see you as a weakness I cannot afford to have." He leaned in closer, his presence commanding and protective. "I didn't come here just to thank you. I came to tell you that from this moment on, you are under my protection. Whether you call that number or not, my shadows will be watching yours." The following week, the shadows Tihayan promised became a tangible, suffocating reality. Amara felt them everywhere: the black sedan that lingered a block behind her bus, the silent men who seemed to blend into the brickwork near her apartment, and the sudden, chilling absence of any other customers when she walked into her local grocery store. Tihayan's protection was a velvet glove, but it was still a fist. The illusion of safety shattered on a rainy Tuesday evening. Amara was locking the restaurant's rear entrance when the hair on her arms stood up. It wasn't the familiar, disciplined presence of Tihayan's men. This was different. A silver van skidded to a halt at the end of the alley, and 3 men in nondescript windbreakers stepped out, their faces obscured by caps. They didn't move like bodyguards, they moved like predators. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. "Don't make a sound," a voice hissed in her ear. It wasn't the attackers, it was one of Tihayan's sentinels. Within seconds, the alley erupted. The silence was punctured by the muffled thwip of suppressed rounds and the heavy thud of bodies hitting wet pavement. Amara was bundled into the back of a black SUV that seemed to materialize out of the rain. The door slammed, and the vehicle roared to life, tires screeching against the asphalt. "Where are you taking me?" she gasped, clutching her bag to her chest. "To somewhere the Jang family's enemies cannot reach," the driver replied, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The city lights blurred into long streaks of neon as they climbed into the hills on the outskirts of Seoul. They pulled up to a fortress-like villa hidden behind high stone walls and weeping willows. Tihayan was waiting on the porch, his silhouette sharp against the warm glow of the interior lights. He looked older, the weight of the week finally visible in the tension of his shoulders. "They found your address," he said without preamble as she stepped out of the car. "My father's loyalists believe I am becoming soft because I haven't eliminated the witness of Table 7. They tried to take you to use as leverage against me." Amara looked at the sprawling, lonely mansion, then back at the man who had brought her here. "So now I'm a prisoner." "You are a guest," Tihayan corrected, stepping closer, until she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. "But in my world, there is very little difference between the two. You stay here until I can ensure that every hand raised against you is lowered, permanently." In the silence of the mountains, Amara realized the restaurant was gone. Her old life was gone, and the only person she could trust was the deadliest man in the country. The sanctuary of the mountain villa was a fragile illusion, shattered by the arrival of a single black-hand gold envelope delivered by a courier whose bow was too deep and stayed too long. Amara watched from the balcony as Tihayan stood in the courtyard, the morning mist clinging to his dark suit like a shroud. When he finally came inside, The air in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The coldness was back in his eyes, the same gaze she had seen at table 7 before the world exploded. "My father is returning to Korean soil in 48 hours, he said, his voice devoid of its recent warmth. He stood by the window, looking out at the jagged peaks that kept them hidden from the world. But he isn't coming back as a father. He is coming back as the chairman to oversee the final transition. The elders have made their decision. To secure the bloodline, I am to be formally inaugurated as the head of the Jang Syndicate." Amara felt a weight settle in her chest, heavier than the fear she had carried in the alleyway. "You told me it was a cage, Tihayan. You told me you were just the architect holding the walls together." "The walls are closing in," he replied, turning to face her. "To lead the syndicate fully means I can no longer hide you in the shadows. It means our lives will be defined by the very violence you saved me from. My father's return means the end of the truce. There will be blood, Amara. There is always blood when a crown changes hands." He walked toward her, his presence overwhelming the small space between them. For the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine agony behind his calculated mask. He was a man being asked to trade his soul for a throne he had grown to despise. The price of his bloodline was a life sentence in a world of steel and silence, and by extension, it was a sentence for her too. "They expect me to take a wife from one of the allied families to solidify the merger," he whispered, his hand hovering near her cheek, but not quite touching it. "But I have already told them that the only woman who will stand beside me is the one who saw the man behind the monster." Amara looked into those dark, piercing eyes and realized the stakes had shifted again. This wasn't just about surviving a sniper anymore. It was about surviving the man he was forced to become. The Empire was waiting, its jagged teeth bared, and as the shadow of his father's return loomed over the peninsula, Amara knew that the most dangerous moment of her life wasn't the explosion at the restaurant. It was the choice she was about to make in this room. The velvet-lined box sat open on the mahogany table, the diamond within it catching the moonlight like a shard of ice. Tihayan stood before Amara, his silhouette framed by the sprawling darkness of the Seoul skyline below. He had offered her everything his world possessed: protection, status, and a loyalty that had already cost lives. But as Amara looked at the ring, she didn't see jewelry. She saw the first link in a golden chain that would pull her forever into the underworld. "You are asking me to be the queen of a graveyard, Tihayan," she said, her voice steady despite the roar of her heart. She stepped away from the table, turning to face him. The grace she had learned on the restaurant floor was now a quiet strength. "You say you love me because I reminded you of your humanity. But if I say yes to this, to the inauguration, to the Jang Syndicate, to the bloodline, that humanity will be the first thing we lose. I won't watch you become the monster they want you to be." Tihayan's jaw tightened, the moonlight sharpening the angular planes of his face. "I am doing this to keep you safe. My father's return is not an invitation, it is a summons. If I walk away, the vacuum will be filled by men far worse than me. They will hunt us." "Then let them hunt us somewhere they can't find us," Amara countered, stepping back into his space, her deep brown eyes locking onto his cold, dark ones. "That is my condition. I will marry you. I will give you my life and my heart, but I will not give them to the chairman. If you want me, you leave this empire behind. No contact with the syndicate, no settling accounts, and no crown. We leave Korea. We go somewhere far away where nobody knows the name Jang Tae-Hyun or Amara Okoye." The silence that followed was suffocating. Tihayan looked down at his hands, hands that were currently poised to take over the most feared organization in the country. To accept her ultimatum was to commit the ultimate betrayal of his bloodline. It was to become a ghost by choice. "You are asking me to become a man with no name," he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't shown since the night at table 7. "I'm asking you to become the man I saved," she replied softly, reaching out to cover his hand with hers. "The choice is yours, Tihayan, the throne or me, but you cannot have both." Tihayan looked at the ring, then at the door where his father's men stood waiting for his answer. Slowly, he reached out and snapped the velvet box shut. The transition happened not with a roar, but with a series of quiet, final clicks. The blackened gold envelope was burned in a silver tray, the ashes scattered into the mountain wind. The custom Italian suits and the concealed weapons were left behind in the villa's dressing room, replaced by simple linens and travel-worn denim. Tihayan stood in the foyer of the mansion, looking at the heavy oak doors that led back to his father's empire, then turned his back on them forever. By the time the chairman's private jet touched down at Incheon International Airport, the man known as the Deadliest Mafia boss had already vanished. There was no grand confrontation, no bloody showdown, only a void where an heir used to be. Tihayan had stripped himself of his name, his bank accounts, and his history, choosing the weight of Amara's hand over the weight of a syndicate. Weeks later, a world away from the neon-soaked streets of Seoul, the air smelled of salt and jasmine instead of gunpowder and rain. In a small coastal town where the pace of life was dictated by the tide rather than tactical calculations, two strangers walked along the shoreline. Amara watched the way the sunlight hit Tihayan's face. The sharp, angular tension that had defined his features for 30 years had finally begun to soften. He no longer scanned every rooftop for snipers or every crowd for shadows. He only looked at her. They had built a new life from scratch, a quiet existence where Amara's observant eyes were used for finding beauty in the landscape rather than danger in the hallways. Tihayan had traded his authority for an anonymous peace, working with his hands in a way that left them clean of the family business. They were just a couple now, two people who had met in a moment of chaos and decided that the world was worth living in if they were together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Tihayan reached out and took Amara's hand. There were no bodyguards, no rival gangs, and no bloodlines demanding a price. There was only the sound of the waves and the realization that the waitress who had dragged a man out of his seat had done more than save his life. She had given him a soul. On this distant shore, the most feared man in Korea was gone, and in his place was a man who was finally, truly free.